By 1890, almost half the people in Britain were unknowingly addicted to something you could buy with your morning bread. It's breakfast in Victorian London. Your tea is black, your bread is stale, and the only thing fresh on the table is a bottle of morphine. In this city, your chemist knows your name and your dosage. They'll sell you cough syrup so strong it was banned in 3 countries before Queen Victoria even died. And if you can't sleep tonight, don't worry, your nightcap is cocaine wine, served in crystal glasses, right next to the family Bible. Tonight. We'll wander through 20 of the strangest, most dangerous, and oddly comforting medicines of the Victorian age. From arsenic beauty wafers to whiskey prescribed by doctors, you'll see how comfort came wrapped in poison. So, like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy slow, strange walks through history. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1885. The bottle sits next to the family Bible. The 2 things guaranteed to bring comfort. You see it there on the mantel, catching the morning light like a jewel, its amber contents glowing faintly through the glass. You might think it's a fine bottle of sherry, something to warm the belly before church. But it's laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol, and in the late 1800s, it was as much a part of daily life in Britain as tea and toast. You wake up in a narrow bed in a room that smells faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. Your bones ache not just from age, but from years of hard work and harder winters. There's bread on the table, but it's yesterday's and has gone stiff at the edges. Beside it, the laudanum bottle waits patiently, the cork stopper darkened from years of opening and closing. A teaspoon of the stuff will make the aches fade. 2 will make you forget you ever had them. In this world, pain is constant. The cold seeps in through the walls, hunger knocks every now and then, and medicine, real medicine, is expensive. Laudanum is the working man's doctor, the housewife's nurse, the infant's babysitter. For a penny, the chemist will sell you enough to last a week. He won't ask questions. He knows you're not here for idle pleasure. You're here because you can't afford to slow down, and a clear head isn't as useful as a numb one. It's given to mothers after childbirth to dull the tearing pain, to men with broken ribs from factory accidents, to farmers whose backs have given out after decades of lifting sacks of grain. It's stirred into warm milk for restless babies, slipped into tea for grandmothers who can't sleep through the night. No one talks about addiction because no one calls it that. It's not dependency, it's habit. It's routine. You pour a measure into your cup and watch it swirl like syrup in the weak morning light. It tastes bitter, a little like oversteeped tea. But within minutes, the world softens. The aches shrink to a whisper. The tension in your jaw loosens. The air feels warmer. The day a little more forgiving. You could almost believe the city outside is a gentler place than it really is. In the streets, laudanum is everywhere sold in apothecaries, advertised in newspapers, tucked into the handbags of respectable ladies on their way to afternoon visits. A fine gentleman might keep a silver flask of it in his pocket, for indigestion during long meetings. A dock worker might swig straight from the bottle when his hands are too stiff to keep working. No one thinks twice about seeing a man dose himself before breakfast. The irony is that the Victorians prided themselves on propriety, on clean living and moral backbone. Yet here was a society quietly running on liquid opium. The same preachers who thundered against drunkenness would, without hesitation, recommend laudanum for nervous complaints. Temperance meant no beer, but a bottle of opium in alcohol was just fine. After all, it wasn't for pleasure, it was for health. Some people took it to escape grief. A widow in black crape might sip from her laudanum glass every evening, just enough to quiet the ghosts. Others took it to endure monotony, a shop clerk counting endless coins, a laundress scrubbing until her fingers bled. And some took it simply because they always had, because the idea of facing the day without that warm fog in their veins felt like stepping outside without shoes. In drawing rooms and back alleys alike, laudanum blurred the edges of reality. It was the perfect Victorian solution, cheap, effective, socially acceptable, and it was slow to kill. You could take it for years before it hollowed you out entirely, before your skin turned sallow, before your mind grew sluggish, before your hands began to tremble even at rest. By then, no one could say if it was the laudanum or just the wear and tear of a hard life. You think of the bottles placed beside the Bible and realize it's no accident. Both promise relief, one for the soul, the other for the body. and in a time when both were in constant need, it made sense to keep them side by side. In your cup, the last traces of laudanum cling to the edges like amber honey. You rinse it down with the dregs of your tea, feeling the warmth spread through you, smoothing over the sharp corners of the morning. Outside, a cart rattles past, iron wheels clanging on cobblestones. Somewhere down the street, a child coughs. Somewhere else, a chemist pulls another cork. The day begins, and for now, it doesn't hurt so much. Tomorrow will be the same. The aches will return, the bottle will be waiting, and you'll pour just enough to make the world tolerable again. Comfort, after all, is worth its price, especially when it comes in a bottle. You duck into a room so thick with smoke you could chew it. The air hangs heavy, not just with the scent of opium, but with something older coal dust from the city outside, damp wool from coats hung on pegs, the faint trace of unwashed skin. The door closes behind you with a muted click, shutting out the drizzle and noise of the London street. In here, time feels stalled. The only clock is the slow curl of smoke rising from long, slender pipes. Your eyes adjust to the dim light, the flicker of an oil lamp half hidden behind a screen. Shadows pool in the corners, turning the faces around you into half-formed shapes. You can make out a man in his 40s lying on a low cot, pipe resting on his chest, his gaze fixed on some private horizon you'll never see. Beside him, a younger man sits cross-legged, swaying slightly, a slow smile spreading across his lips as if he's just heard a joke whispered by the walls. There's no rush here, no urgency. Outside, London is a place of clocks, whistles, and timetable strains to catch, debts to pay, meals to cook before the gas lamps burn low. But here, in the opium den, all of that softens. The clanging urgency of the industrial age fades to a dull hum. This is a room for drifting, for letting go of the harness that keeps you pulling through the day. You find a spot on a thin mat against the wall. Someone passes you a pipe, the stem worn smooth from years of use. The opium inside has been heated until it's thick and resinous, its scent sweet and faintly bitter. You draw in the smoke, and it rolls into your lungs like warm velvet. Within moments, the edges of the room blur, your shoulders loosen. The world beyond the door slips away as if it never existed. Opium dens in Victorian London were both scandal and secret. The newspapers wrote of them as foreign vices, imported from the East, dens of sin tucked into Limehouse and the docks. In truth, the clientele was far from exotic. Sailors fresh off the ship, dock workers looking to spend a night away from the wet cold, gentlemen from the West End, coats turned up, who claimed to be curious but returned week after week. Women came two-shop girls, widows, those with nowhere else to be. It was an odd sort of democracy. In the haze of the room, it didn't matter if your boots were hand-stitched or patched with twine. Everyone was here for the same reason: to drift, to slip the knot of reality for a while. Some came to chase visions, bright landscapes, impossible colours, conversations with people who'd been dead for years. Others came simply to rest in a way they couldn't anywhere else. The den's keeper moves quietly between the mats, refilling pipes, adjusting the lamps, murmuring now and then to a regular who's drifted too far. He knows each face, each preferred dose. He also knows the risks. There are stories of people who never woke up, but those are spoken of in low tones, with a kind of grim respect. Death here is not a shock, it's more like someone deciding not to come back from a journey. Hours pass without notice. There is no drinking, no loud laughter, no cards slapped on the table. The only sound is the occasional exhale, the scrape of a pipe stem on the edge of a lamp, the soft shifting of bodies, and in the pauses between, there's a strange intimacy. In a city where every day is a contest for space, food, and breath. This is a rare place where no one is pushing forward. Your thoughts wander in a way they never do outside. A half-remembered song drifts into your mind. Something your mother sang when you were small. The smell of baking bread from a street you haven't walked in 20 years comes back, so vivid you could reach out and touch the shop door. Memories dissolve into dreams, dreams into something stranger. The man on the cot seems to be talking to the shadows. The woman 2 mats over stares at her hands like they hold the secrets of the universe. It's not all soft edges. Beneath the piece is something hollow. You notice the tremor in an old sailor's hand when he lifts his pipe. You see the way the younger man's smile fades the moment the smoke leaves his lungs, replaced by something brittle and anxious. and you realize the den's quiet is not the quiet of safety, it's the quiet of surrender. Still, it's easy to understand the pull. Out there, every step is a fight against cold, hunger, and the grind of the machine. In here, the fight is suspended. You can lie down, close your eyes, and float. You don't have to think about the rent due Monday or the cough that hasn't gone away for months. You don't have to think at all. Eventually, the keeper taps your foot, a gentle reminder that you've had your turn. The pipe is taken away. The smoke in the room feels thicker now, like a curtain you have to push through. Standing makes the world tilt, and you hold the wall until your legs remember what they're for. The door opens, letting in a sharp blade of cold air, and you step back into the street. The noise of London rushes in hoofbeats on cobblestones, a vendor shouting the price of oysters, the distant clang of a ship's bell from the river. Your clothes smell faintly sweet, and your head is full of half-formed dreams that fade as the wind cuts through you. You know the world you've returned to hasn't changed in your absence, but for a while you were somewhere else, somewhere softer, stranger, and as you walk away, you understand why the faces in that room will be there again tomorrow night, in a city that never lets you stop moving. The opium den is the one place you can stand still, the one place where reality waits politely at the door, and you can decide, just for a few hours, not to let it back in. Forget flossing, just dab a little cocaine on your gums. That was the Victorian dentist's solution to just about everything that could go wrong inside your mouth. Toothache keeping you up at night, cocaine. Swollen gums after a bad extraction, cocaine. Feeling a little shy before speaking at a dinner party. Well, why not? It came in tiny glass bottles with elegant paper labels, the kind that wouldn't look out of place beside fine perfume. Some were sold as cocaine toothache drops, others as cocaine solution or cocaine hydrochloride, and all of them promised the same miracle instant relief. And they delivered. A single dab numbed pain so completely that you could almost forget the blackened stump still in your jaw. Almost. The brilliance of danger, depending on your point of view, was how quickly it worked. A few seconds after applying it, the pain dulled to nothing. A minute later, you might feel unusually cheerful, light on your feet, even eager to chat with the neighbour you'd been avoiding for weeks. By the 10-minute mark, you could be telling stories at the pub as if you'd been preparing for them all year. The line between dentistry and recreation was thin, and most people didn't bother worrying about which side they were on. Dentists loved it because it kept patients in the chair. No more flinching, no more involuntary jerks when the drill hit a nerve. Cocaine meant steady hands, steady tools, and the ability to work faster. Patients loved it because, for the first time in history, they could walk into a dental appointment without dread. Some of them walked out with a little bottle tucked discreetly in their coat pocket just in case. But it didn't stop at the dental office. Housewives kept it in the medicine cabinet next to laudanum. Parents dabbed it on teething babies' gums, convinced they were doing a kindness. Shopkeepers used it before long days of talking to customers, finding that their customer service suddenly improved. A travelling salesman might take a dose before stepping off the train in a new town, ready to charm an entire street of strangers. The advertisements made it sound almost quaint. For relief of toothache and nervousness, one claimed, as if cocaine was simply another home remedy like peppermint tea or warm salt water. Another featured a cherubic child smiling wide, his little gums presumably blissfully numb. No one mentioned dependency, not in the way we understand it now. If you found yourself applying it 3 or 4 times a day, well, perhaps you were simply prone to dental troubles. There was an odd kind of optimism about it all. Victorian Britain was a place where discomfort was expected, where the working man's back ached. The streets smelled of coal and sewage, and the dentist's chair was a place of genuine fear. Cocaine was like a modern luxury dropped into that world fast, effective, clean in its own way. It made people feel sharper, more alive, more capable. In a time when most medicine dulled the senses, cocaine seemed to hand them back, polished and buzzing. Of course, there were signs. The shop clerk who began talking too fast, selling more in a day than in the previous week. The respectable matron whose dinner parties became more animated and louder over the months. The dock worker who stopped feeling the pain in his rotting teeth altogether and never bothered to have them pulled. Cocaine made everything easier until it didn't. The crash, when it came, was slow enough that you could pretend it wasn't happening. For the dentists, there was no going back. Once patients knew what it felt like to have a tooth pulled without agony, they weren't going to sit still for a return to whiskey swigs and white-knuckle endurance. Even as whispers began about the side effects, bottles continued to be sold over the counter without so much as a raised eyebrow. Imagine walking into your local chemist in 1895. The wooden floors creak under your boots, glass jars of herbs line the shelves, and somewhere in the back, a pestle grinds slowly against a mortar. You ask for cocaine toothache drops, and the chemist doesn't bat an eye. He reaches for the bottle, wraps it in brown paper, and hands it over with a polite nod. No prescription, no warning label, just the quiet understanding that you've bought yourself a pocket-sized miracle. You might take a dose on the way home, the bitter taste spreading across your tongue, the numbness creeping in like frost. By the time you step through your front door, the pain's gone and your mood's lifted. You notice the wallpaper doesn't look quite so drab. The fire burns a little brighter. The evening feels full of possibilities. Dinner with the family? Why not? A stroll down to the pub? Absolutely. The ache will be back tomorrow, but tomorrow is tomorrow's problem. It's easy to see why people trusted it. The Victorians lived in a world that rarely offered quick fixes. Most ailments were endured, not cured, but here was a substance that worked in seconds, and if it happened to make you a bit more charming along the way, well, that was just good fortune. By the turn of the century, the shine had begun to dull. Doctors started noticing the restlessness, the insomnia, the weight loss. Dentists noticed patients whose gums had gone pale and thin, who came back not because the tooth still hurt, but because they couldn't stand the silence in their own heads. But for a good 20 years, cocaine toothache drops were the smiling face of modern medicine. They were the promise that pain could be erased, that you could walk through your day untroubled, confident, even happy. And in a way, that promise was true, just not forever. The relief was real. The carefreeness was real. And for the people who lived in that narrow slice of time, it must have felt like the future had arrived in a bottle small enough to fit in your pocket. Tomorrow, your teeth might throb again. Tomorrow, the smile might fade. But tonight, you can talk without wincing, laugh without flinching, and for a little while, believe that life is, if not perfect, at least bearable. And in the Victorian age, that was worth its weight in gold. One spoonful and you might sleep until the next coronation. That was the quiet promise of chloral hydrate, the Victorian era's first safe sleeping draught. Safe in the way a winter river looks still and harmless before you step on the ice. It came in small brown bottles, thick glass to shield it from the light, with labels written in fine script that made it look almost romantic, for the relief of insomnia, nervousness, and agitation. That word relief was the hook. In a world where the city never really slept, where coal dust crept under the door and the sound of horse hooves echoed through the streets at all hours, sleep wasn't something you assumed would come. It was something you had to earn, or buy. You pour a measure into a glass, watch it dissolve in water like a ghost slipping into the room. The taste is faintly bitter, but no one drinks chloral hydrate for pleasure. You drink it for absence, for the quiet space between now and morning when the thoughts finally stop rattling. For Victorians, night was a long, uneven country. Gas lamps flickered but never truly pushed back the dark. In boarding houses, thin walls leaked every sound, footsteps overhead. The coughing of a neighbour, the late clink of bottles. In richer homes, the insomnia was quieter but no less stubborn. The creak of the old floorboards, the rush of your own blood in your ears, the worry over ledgers and letters, and so chloral hydrate slid into the culture as a kind of miracle. It was the first real chemical sleep aid that didn't have to come with a hangover of whiskey fumes. Doctors prescribed it to businessmen whose minds spun too fast at night, to widows who couldn't close their eyes without seeing the empty chair, to actors who needed to rest between late performances. It became the friend at the bedside, the guarantee that you wouldn't spend the night staring at the ceiling until dawn bled grey into the curtains. The effect was gentle, at first. 10 minutes after drinking, your body would feel heavier, your jaw slackening as if someone had loosened an invisible knot at the base of your skull. Thoughts still came, but they were slower, softer, as if they'd been wrapped in wool. The street sounds dulled, the bed felt deeper, and then, without ceremony, the world simply went away. That was the beauty of it, and the danger. Because once you learned you could choose unconsciousness, it was hard to go back to lying awake with the worry and the noise. People began to take it not just on restless nights, but on nights when tomorrow seemed too far away or too difficult to meet. In working-class districts, it was used to make the shift from factory floor to fitful rest. In more genteel neighbourhoods, it was the unspoken answer to the question, how do you manage such a busy life? The truth was that half of the managing happened unconscious, with a spoonful of chloral in the bloodstream. There was something almost ceremonial about it. The bottle kept in a locked cabinet, the glass on the nightstand, the measured porno more than the doctor had written, no less than you knew would work. The quiet moment before the first sip, as if you were signing an agreement with the night you give me peace. I give you hours you'll never remember. But chloral hydrate had a way of blurring more than just the edges of the day. Take enough of it, often enough, and your waking hours began to feel like they were being lived underwater. Reaction times slowed, thoughts took longer to arrive, the world stayed hazy, and some people didn't seem to mind, for those caught in grief, debt, or endless labour. That haze was the point. Doctors noticed the dependency before the public did. They called it chloral habit, a polite term for a need that grew until the night felt impossible without it. Some patients came to prefer the sleep it gave them to any waking life at all. There were quiet scandals, a politician who slept through crucial votes, a widow who rested through entire weekends. The drug didn't just put you to sleep, it kept you from feeling the slow grind of time. Still, the sales didn't slow. Because for all the warnings, chloral hydrate was the first time people could buy not just medicine, but silence. Silence from the body, silence from the mind, silence from the outside world. In a century of noise and industry, that was worth far more than the pennies it cost. You finish your glass, the bitterness lingering at the back of your tongue. The lamp on your nightstand burns low, the wick bending like it's tired too. You stretch out under the covers, feel the bed accept your weight. Your breathing slows without effort. Somewhere outside, a carriage rattles past. The horse's hooves a distant rhythm. You hear it, but it's already part of a dream you've begun to drift into. And if you don't wake until well after the bells of St. Paul's have rung in the morning, you won't mind. That's the point. Chloral hydrate was never about a natural sleep, it was about the mercy of forgetting the night entirely. It's not magic, it's morphine. That was the unspoken truth behind one of the most trusted bottles in the Victorian home, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. The name alone sounded harmless, almost maternal. It promised comfort, calm, and blessed silence in a world where children's cries echoed through cramped rooms and thin walls. But the comfort came with a cost, and the silence was deeper than anyone liked to admit. You find the bottle on a kitchen shelf, nestled between the flour tin and a jar of treacle. The label is neat, polite, printed in looping script that might have been copied from a family Bible. For teething, fussiness, colic, and nervousness, it reads, "There's no mention of the morphine inside, why spoil the magic mothers had been using it for decades, passing down the habit like a recipe 1 teaspoon for a restless infant, 2 for a stubborn toddler, maybe a little extra if you have visitors coming and can't stand the noise." The Victorian household was rarely quiet. Babies were born into air already thick with soot and steam, and their first sounds often blended with the clatter of carts, the rumble of factories, and the shouting of market stalls. Sleep was a luxury for parents, especially mothers, whose days stretched from before dawn to well past dark. Soothing Syrup offered what no amount of rocking, singing, or pacing the floor could guarantee stillness. The dose was simple, a small spoon, the dark amber liquid sticking to the metal before sliding down into the child's mouth. The bitterness was masked with sugar, the way a baker hides a flaw under frosting. Within minutes, the fussing softened to whimpers, the kicking slowed, and the eyelids drooped. A whole household could breathe again. No one called it sedation. They called it rest. And in a time when sickness could sweep through a family without warning, when breadwinners could be laid low by injury and children could be lost to a single night's fever, the quiet seemed like a small mercy. Mothers told themselves it was kindness. Fathers told themselves it was necessary. Neighbours told themselves it was none of their business. The truth, whispered in medical journals and among more cautious doctors, was that Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup contained enough morphine to make even a grown man drowsy. In an infant, it could stop the crying entirely and sometimes everything else. but warnings rarely travelled as far or as fast as the syrup itself. The advertisements still appeared in newspapers, showing serene mothers with sleeping children in their arms, promising peace for baby and rest for mother. Who wouldn't want that the syrup was cheap, easy to find, and socially acceptable? It was sold in corner shops beside baking soda and vinegar, in apothecaries alongside cough lozenges and tonic water. No prescription, no caution label, just a friendly guarantee of relief. For many families, it was as much a part of child-rearing as lullabies and bedtime prayers. In working-class districts, it kept children quiet while mothers scrubbed floors or took in sewing by lamplight. The only way to keep food on the table. In wealthier homes, nannies administered it to ensure that little ones slept through the night, leaving the adults free to entertain without interruption. The reasoning was the same: a quiet child is a good child. But quiet could mean many things. Sometimes it meant a baby finally at peace after hours of shrill crying. Sometimes it meant a child lying too still, their breathing so shallow you had to lean close to hear it. And sometimes it meant a crib that stayed silent forever. Those stories didn't make it into the ads. By the 1870s, a few doctors began to raise alarms, noting that infants given the syrup regularly seemed pale, thin, and slow to wake. Some developed what they called infantile stupor, a polite phrase for a constant drugged haze. But for every warning, there were a dozen mothers ready to swear by the syrup, claiming it had saved their sanity, maybe even their lives. The Victorian age was not a gentle one for children. Many were sent to work before they could read, hauling coal, cleaning chimneys, or running errands in the freezing rain. Illness was constant, accidents common. In that context, a few spoonfuls of morphine to keep them still didn't seem monstrous. It seemed practical. Imagine the scene: a mother alone in a narrow, cold kitchen. Her husband is at the docks, gone for 14 hours. Her eldest son has a fever. The baby has been crying since before dawn. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. She reaches for the bottle, uncorks it with a practiced twist, and tips the syrup into a spoon. The baby swallows, fusses for a moment, then drifts into sleep. The kitchen goes quiet. The mother leans against the wall, eyes closed, her body remembering what rest feels like. No one told her about dosage charts or toxicity. No one explained that morphine built tolerance quickly, that more would be needed each time for the same effect. No one talked about the risks of withdrawal in tiny bodies. In a world without safety nets, she wasn't looking for perfect health, just enough peace to make it to the next day. And so, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup became part of the unspoken pact between Victorian parents and their children. You'll be quiet, and I'll keep you safe as best I can. The syrup kept its end of the bargain every time, though sometimes at the highest price. Even now, the bottle sits in the kitchen of memory, dark and unassuming, its label neat and polite. It's easy to see why it was trusted for so long, because in an era where survival was a daily negotiation, silence was more than golden, it was a necessity. And morphine, wrapped in sugar and sold under a mother's name, delivered that necessity in every teaspoon. The flowers are whispering secrets, and so is the hostess's hat. Or at least, that's how it feels after your second or is it your third deep breath of ether. Victorian parties were not always the rigid, porcelain affairs we imagine. Behind lace curtains and respectable fades, there were gatherings that had little to do with tea and polite conversation, and everything to do with intoxicating curiosity. Ether parties were part parlour game, part chemical dare, and entirely at odds with the sober, moral image the age tried so hard to project. It starts innocently enough. You arrive at the townhouse expecting sherry and small talk. The hostess greets you in a flurry of silk and perfume, ushering you into a parlour already warm with laughter. The gaslight glows low, and there's a faint, sweet sharp scent in the air like overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. You think it might be the flowers on the table. It isn't. On a sideboard, beside the crystal decanter of port and a plate of almond biscuits, sits a small glass bottle and a stack of folded linen handkerchiefs. The hostess claps her hands for attention, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Shall we play?" she says, as if inviting everyone to charades. She dips a handkerchief into the bottle until it glistens, then hands it to the gentleman beside her. "Breathe in," she instructs, "and tell us what you see." Ether moves quickly. The first inhalation burns a little, then warms. The second makes the room tilt pleasantly, as though the carpet has decided to sway like a ship's deck. The conversation grows louder, though you're not sure if anyone's actually speaking more or if your ears are just turning up the volume on everything. Colours feel richer. Someone's waistcoat, which was merely green before, is now the green of summer gardens after rain. The air tastes like laughter. The gentleman exhales and announces, with great seriousness, that the piano has been looking at him. This sends the room into hysterics. The hostess takes her turn next, giggling before the handkerchief even touches her lips. She claims she can hear the ferns gossiping about the roses. Everyone nods knowingly. In this room, such things are possible. Ether parties had their own rhythm. The bottle would make its way around the circle like a deck of cards at a gambling table. People would sink into chairs, heads tipped back, eyes half-lidded, wearing blissful smiles. Conversation became more daring, less bound by the strict etiquette of the drawing room. Compliments grew more extravagant. Confessions slipped out, wrapped in laughter. Even those who normally guarded their tongues found themselves leaning forward, speaking low, as if sharing a scandal too delicious to keep. In the city, ether was easy enough to find. It was a surgical anaesthetic, sold by chemists to doctors, dentists, and quietly to anyone with the right connections. Most people thought of it as something serious, something for operating rooms. But in private homes, it became a novelty, a safe-seeming way to flirt with altered states without touching the moral stain of alcohol or the dangerous reputation of opium. Of course, safe was an illusion. Ether was flammable, volatile, and capable of stopping a heart if overindulged. But in the heat of the parlour, with the gas lamps glowing and the laughter bubbling like champagne, no one wanted to think about that. The point wasn't to be sensible, it was to feel the ordinary world slip just far enough away to make it funny. One guest, a young barrister, swears he can taste music. Another insists she has just solved the question of life after death, but refuses to explain, preferring to keep everyone in suspense. A third is content to sit cross-legged on the floor, stroking the fringe of the carpet as though it's the most beautiful thing she's ever touched. The hostess moves through the room like a conductor, making sure the bottle keeps circulating, refolding fresh handkerchiefs, keeping the mood high but not yet tipping into collapse. There is a strange skill to it, knowing just how much to give each guest, reading their faces for that moment when delight turns to dizziness. Too much, and the party could sour. Too little, and the magic never quite arrives. Outside, the city is dark and cold. Horses clatter over cobblestones, their breath steaming in the night air. Somewhere, a factory whistle blows, but inside, time has loosened. The windows are fogged with warmth and exhalations. The air smells of perfume, pastries, and that sharp, sweet chemical whisper. Eventually, the bottle runs low. The hostess tucks it away, her movement still graceful, though her smile is softer now, less fixed. Guests lean back in their chairs, blinking slowly as if waking from a shared dream. Someone starts a tune on the piano, not the one that was staring earlier, and a few voices join in, off-key, but happy. The dangerous edge of the evening has passed, leaving behind only the glow, the memory of having stepped outside reality for an hour or two. No one calls it a vice. In the retelling, ether parties are just a bit of harmless fun, a lark among friends, something to make the winter shorter, the nights brighter, the conversations looser. But you remember the moment when the floor swayed under you, when the flowers whispered in your ear, and you wonder, was it you who laughed at danger, or danger who laughed at you? And perhaps that's why the memory lingers long after the sharp centres faded, because for one night, you were part of a private rebellion against the rules of the age, a rebellion hidden in a handkerchief soaked with invisible fire. The solution to gin is always more gin, at least that's how it goes in the alleys of Victorian London. Gin is to drink here, it's a currency, a warm coat in winter, a forget-me-not for those with too much to remember. They call it Mother's Ruin, and the name has the dull weight of truth. It ruins mornings, marriages, and minds, but somehow it still tastes like relief. You find it in a chipped mug in the hands of a dock worker before the sun's up, in a green glass bottle tucked into the skirts of a washerwoman on her way home from the public baths. It's not champagne, there's no elegance to it. Gin is blunt, quick, and unforgiving. One swig and your belly burns, 2 swigs and the world tilts in your favour, at least for a while. The gin shops never really close. Even when the shutters are drawn, there's a back door, a knock, a wink. Inside, the air is heavy with the smell of juniper and sweat, the floor's sticky underfoot, the walls lean in as if they've heard too many secrets. The barman doesn't ask how your day went. He knows. That's why you're here. For a penny, you get a measure poured straight into your tin cup. For another penny, he won't water it down. It's the same for everyone: labourers, soldiers on leave, widows who've pawned their last decent coat. Gin erases the borders between them. After a few sips, the distinctions blur between hunger and fullness, sorrow and laughter, shame and defiance. The morning crowd is different from the night crowd. In the mornings, it's the ones who need to stop their hands from shaking before work. Men who unload cargo down at the docks. Women who scrub floors for pennies, people who can't afford a slow start. Gin steadies them, puts steel in their spines, even if that steel bends by nightfall. By evening, the mood shifts. Lamps burn low. The place fills with laughter too loud for the size of the room. Cards are slapped down on splintered tables. Someone sings off-key. A couple argues in the corner with the practiced rhythm of two people who've done it 100 times before. Every story told grows a little taller, every promise a little wilder. Someone says they'll quit tomorrow. Someone else says tomorrow's already ruined. So why not stay? Gin doesn't just fuel the night, it loops it. You drink to forget the trouble that gin caused the night before. You drink to push through the hangover that gin gifted you at dawn. The cure for gin is always more gin, and no one in the shop pretends otherwise. The authorities frown on it. Of course. They publish pamphlets warning of gin's moral decay, its effect on family life, its role in crime. Preachers thunder against it from the pulpit, painting pictures of mothers neglecting their children, men spending their week's wages before they even leave the shop. But the preachers don't pay your rent. They don't stand in your shoes when the factory foreman says there's no work this week. For women, gin is both liberation and trap. It gives a sharp-tongued courage in arguments, a warm fuzz in cold beds. It also gives a reputation that's hard to shake. A woman who drinks gin is assumed to be trouble, and soon enough, trouble finds her. For men, it's an equal opportunity destroyer too much, and you're liable to wake up in a cell, missing your boots, your wages, or both. The nickname Mother's Ruin started as a warning. It became a kind of dare. Every glass says go on, take the ruin if you can bear it, and in a city where survival is already a gamble, ruin can feel like just another hand to play. Some nights, the gin shop feels like the only honest place in London. No one pretends here. You're either up or you're down, and the gin doesn't care which. It will warm you, spin you, and drop you in the gutter all the same. And somehow, that blunt truth is more comforting than the polite lies served in finer rooms. By closing time, if there is one feet shuffle on the sticky floor, and the air is thick with the mingled scent of juniper, damp coats, and regret. Outside, the fog curls low over the cobblestones. Some people lean on friends for the walk home, others lean on strangers, some don't make it home at all. Morning will come, as it always does. The light will be harsh, the head will pound, and the hands will shake, and when that happens, the cure will be waiting in a chipped mug, for the price of a penny, and whatever's left of your resolve. Because in Victorian London, the solution to gin is, and always will be, more gin. Restores lost manliness, or possibly your will to live. That's what the label promises, in looping gold script, on a bottle so handsome you might forget it's medicine at all. The glass catches the light in deep amber tones, the cork sealed with red wax, the paper label bordered in intricate filigree. It looks like it belongs in a gentleman's study, not on a chemist's shelf. And that is the genius of the Victorian patent medicine. It didn't just sell you a cure, it sold you a dream you could pour into a glass. Patent medicine is a polite phrase. It conjures images of licensed invention and reliable science. In reality, most of these bottles were neither patented nor particularly medicinal. What they were without fail was profitable. Inside might be opium, cocaine, alcohol, chloroform, or any mix of the four, wrapped in enough sugar or syrup to make it go down smoothly. Every label told a story, and every story was a little dishonest. You could walk into a shop with a cough and leave with a tonic that promised to improve your digestion, fortify your nerves, sharpen your mind, and restore your vital powers all in one go. The shopkeeper would nod gravely, as if confiding in you, and mention how this very bottle had cured the mayor's lumbago or the local vicar's melancholy. No prescription required, only a few shillings and the willingness to believe. The market was enormous because the fears were universal. Men worried about fading virility and the creeping weakness of age. Women worried about female troubles and nervous exhaustion. Parents worried about children too thin, too quiet, too sickly. And for every fear, there was a bottle waiting. Some promised strength, doctor. Rawlings' elixir of manhood, laced with enough alcohol to make you forget you felt weak in the first place. Some promised beauty, Madame Felicis complexion restorer, with just enough arsenic to give the skin a ghostly pale glow. Others promised peace, Nirvana nerve drops, which were mostly morphine in disguise. Advertising was an art form. Patent medicine companies knew how to turn desperation into sales copy. Posters showed ruddy-cheeked men chopping wood after just one dose, or radiant women surrounded by cherubic children. The colours were bold, the typeface loud, the promises louder still. Restores the appetite, the constitution, and the marriage bed for all ailments of man or beast. The cure that never fails in poorer districts. These bottles were a kind of affordable luxury. A family might not afford meat every week, but they could scrape together enough for a tonic that promised to banish fatigue. The taste alone sweet, spiced, with a warming burn was enough to make you feel something was happening. And in a way, something was the opiate soothed the body. The alcohol loosened the mind. The sugar comforted the tongue. You felt better, at least for a while. In wealthier homes, the bottles were displayed openly, almost like trophies. Visitors could admire the imported glass, the foreign-sounding names French, if you wanted elegance, German, if you wanted science. Hosts would offer you a dose in the same tone they might offer a fine port, and if you felt a rush of euphoria followed by hours of drowsy contentment, well, wasn't that proof it worked? The dangers were hidden behind the elegance. Labels rarely listed ingredients, and when they did, they used vague terms like herbal essences or botanical extracts. Few people realized how potent these concoctions were until someone collapsed or worse. There were stories, whispered in back rooms, about babies who never woke after being dosed with soothing syrups, or old men who fell asleep in their chairs and didn't rise again. But the newspapers printed more advertisements than warnings, and so the bottles kept selling. It wasn't just the chemicals, it was the psychology. Patent medicines thrived on the promise that you didn't have to see a doctor, didn't have to admit weakness to another person. You could buy your courage, your beauty, your health in private. No judgment, no questions. Just you, the bottle, and the promise printed in gold. The rituals of use were almost as important as the effects. A gentleman might pour a measured teaspoon into cut glass and sip it slowly, savouring the warmth as it slid down. A housewife might hide a bottle in the back of the pantry, doling out small sips during the day when the children's noise grew too loud. A labourer might take his dose in the alley behind the shop, tossing the empty bottle into the gutter. And still, for all the dangers, these medicines were woven into the rhythm of Victorian life. They were birthday gifts, wedding presents, tokens of sympathy for the bereaved. They crossed oceans and borders, carried in steamer trunks and carpet bags. In the eyes of their makers, they weren't just selling a liquid, they were selling hope in a bottle. Hope is a powerful drug, stronger even than morphine. It tells you tomorrow will be better, that the ache will fade, that the problem can be solved. And in the moment the cork is pulled, when the scent of herbs and alcohol rises to meet you, it's easy to believe that's true. So you take another sip, let the warmth spread through your chest, and tell yourself the label wouldn't lie not to you. After all, it says right there, in elegant script, restores lost manliness or possibly your will to live. And in this moment, that's enough. What could possibly go wrong? That's the question half whispered, half smirked that hovers over every box of arsenic beauty wafers. The packaging is exquisite, a pale ivory tin embossed with curling gold letters, promising a perfect complexion forever. It looks like something you'd keep on a vanity beside a silverback brush. Not in a locked cabinet marked poison. In the Victorian mind, pale skin wasn't just fashion, it was proof. Proof that you didn't labour in fields, that your body was shielded from sun and dirt, that you belonged to a class who could afford to stay indoors. A healthy tan might suit fishermen or soldiers, but for the well-born, whiteness was currency. and if your skin wasn't naturally porcelain, there were ways to correct it. The wafers were small, thin, and chalky, dissolving slowly on the tongue with the faint metallic tang of danger. They were made with arsenic trioxide, a substance better known for killing rats, but in safe doses. The advertisements claimed it would work a miracle. Arsenic, they said, purified the blood, smoothed the skin, and banished blemishes. A pale glow would bloom from within, like moonlight on silk. You could find the ads in ladies' magazines, nestled between recipes and embroidery patterns. They featured soft focus illustrations of women with impossibly smooth faces, their eyes wide and untroubled. The copy never mentioned the word poison, only refined mineral, as though the wafers were a gift from the earth itself, beloved by actresses, admired by society. One slogan purred, guaranteed to bring out the beauty you were born to possess. In drawing rooms and boudoirs, the wafers became a secret shared between friends. One lady might lean close at a card table and murmur, "Try these only one after breakfast and one after dinner." The tone was conspiratorial, the way people now share the name of a particularly skilled surgeon. You didn't speak of them in mixed company, but you noticed who else had that new, luminous pallor. At first, the changes felt magical. The skin did smooth, redness faded, freckles lightened as if winter itself had settled into the pores. Compliments came quickly. "My dear, you've never looked so well rested. How do you keep such a perfect complexion in this dreadful London air? But arsenic doesn't work like paint, it works like rot." The same chemical that silenced rats also silenced the small, unseen functions of the body. Appetite faded, but so did the ability to fight infection. The glow on the skin came at the cost of the blood beneath it. Hair grew brittle, nails thinned, breath came shorter on the stairs. The women who took them didn't connect these changes to the wafer's knot at first. Illness was common enough in Victorian life. A cough could be just the damp. Fatigue could be overexertion. The line between beauty and sickness was so blurred that one could be mistaken for the other. Some did suspect, of course. Doctors occasionally published warnings about complexion powders of a dangerous composition, but for every warning there was a testimonial in a glossy pamphlet swearing the wafers were harmless when used as directed. And besides, what choice did a woman have? A plain face was a disadvantage. A sallow one could ruin a season's prospects. There were men, 2 actors, dandies, even politicians who took the wafers in secret. Public life was brutal on the aging face. Under gaslight, a pale, smooth complexion read as vitality, no matter the truth beneath, and arsenic, for all its cruelty, was cheaper than a lifetime of cold cream and better lit than candlelight could ever be. The ritual of taking them was as important as the effect. The tin, warm from being held in the hand, the crisp pop of the lid, the faint smell sweet and sharp when it opened. A wafer placed delicately on the tongue, left to dissolve like a guilty thought. In that moment, you could imagine you were doing something refined, even medicinal, instead of courting the slowest form of self-destruction. Deaths did happen, though rarely in ways dramatic enough to make headlines. More often, it was a gentle decliner, winter illness that became pneumonia, a lingering fever that the body simply couldn't fight off. Friends would whisper, "She was always so delicate," as if delicacy were a compliment instead of a cause. The truth is, arsenic beauty wafers worked exactly as intended. They delivered a beauty so ethereal it seemed unbound by the needs of flesh and blood. They gave you the look of someone half in this world and half already gone. In Victorian society, that was often considered the height of romance, and so the tins kept selling, passed from chemist to customer, from friend to friend, from mother to daughter, because beauty, in this world, was worth nearly anything except perhaps the breath it took to keep it. The green fairy works quickly. That's what they call her in the cafes of Paris, the bohemian salons of London, and in the dim back rooms where the poets gather, absinthe. The name sounds almost medical precise, clinical, but the drink is anything but. In the glass, it is pale emerald, the colour of spring leaves seen through stained glass. In the mouth, it's sharp and herbal, with a bitterness that lingers like an unfinished thought. And in the mind, well, that's where she does her real work. They say absinthe is not a drink, but a muse in liquid form. In the 19th century, artists, writers, and painters made a ritual of it. You didn't just pour a measure into a tumbler. No, there was ceremony. A slotted silver spoon rested across the rim, holding a cube of sugar. You poured ice-cold water over the sugar, watching the clear green turn milky, swirling into a cloudy opal haze. This was called the lausch, and it was as much a part of the intoxication as the alcohol itself. The first sip was bright and medicinal wormwood, anise, fennel enough to make your tongue tingle. By the second, your shoulders loosened, your pulse slowed, and the edges of the room began to soften. By the third, the conversation around you was louder, wittier, funnier. The green fairy was already dancing in your blood. In the cafes of Montmartre, absinthe was the common thread between strangers. A painter might lean over to a journalist, offering to buy the next round, and by midnight they'd be sketching each other on napkins. It was a drink of invention, of improvisation. Ideas that would seem absurd in the morning felt perfectly reasonable at 1:30. That painting you've been struggling with, make it blue. That poem you've been stuck on, tear it in half and read only the odd lines. The green fairy rewards boldness. But absinthe was also strong, much stronger than most drinks of the day. Distilled at high proof and laced with wormwood's thujon, it didn't just intoxicate, it enchanted. And enchantment is a tricky business. At first, it sharpened the senses, the gaslight seemed to glow more warmly, the music from the caf piano richer. But as the night deepened, reality began to blur. Shadows stretched a little too far. Colours bled into one another. You could swear you heard the clink of glasses whispering back to you. Not everyone drank it for art. In the seedier bars along the river, absinthe was just another way to get drunk quickly and forget the day. It was cheap enough, potent enough, and for those on the margins, dock workers, soldiers on leave, women looking for a warm corner to sit in, it was a shortcut to oblivion. There, the green fairy didn't bring inspiration. She brought stillness, the heavy, dreamless kind. In polite society, absinthe carried a dangerous glamour. It was exotic, foreign, slightly scandalous. To be seen drinking it was to announce that you were not entirely bound by the rules of the drawing room. You might be respectable by day, but at night you kept company with artists, anarchists, and women who smoked their own cigarettes. Governments grew nervous. Newspapers ran lurid stories of absinthe-crazed crimesmen who claimed they'd been driven to violence by too many glasses, women who'd abandoned their families for the bottle. Whether the drink truly caused madness or merely attracted the already mad hardly mattered. The myth was set. Campaigners began calling it the green curse. Laws were passed, in some countries as it was banned outright, and yet, in back rooms and basements, the ritual continued. The sugar cubes still melted into the milky green swirl. The spoon still clinked gently on glass. The fairy still made her rounds, whispering into the ears of anyone willing to listen. For some, she left gifts a sudden insight, a new verse, a painting unlike anything they were dared before. For others, she left only the hangover, a mouth like dust, a head that throbbed with the memory of too many bright lights and too much talk. Absinthe was never about the drink alone. It was about who you were when you drank it, the daring, reckless, inspired version of yourself that you couldn't quite reach sober. It was about the friends who felt like family for a few greenlit hours, the strangers whose names you never learned but whose laughter you still remembered years later. The green fairy works quickly, yes, but she also works deeply. Once she's visited, part of you will always be listening for her footsteps, watching for that shimmer of green in a glass across the room. And if you do see her again, you'll remember exactly how the night feels when she takes your hand and leads you, once more, into the dream. Even the wallpaper seems a bit less judgmental. That's the first thing you notice after a teaspoon of cannabis tincture. In the bright glass windows of a Victorian apothecary, it sits among the respectable medicines, between the peppermint oil for indigestion and the cod liver oil for general vigour. There's nothing scandalous about it. No lurid posters, no whispered transactions in the alley. It's sold in amber bottles with neat cream labels, measured in drams and drops, as proper as anything could be. The liquid is dark, almost syrupy, with a faint herbal scent that clings to the cork stopper. The instructions say, for agitation, nervous conditions, and sleeplessness. Take with water or milk. No mention of intoxication. The pharmacist might describe it as a nerve tonic, a phrase that suggests composure rather than abandon. In Victorian London, cannabis tincture was as legal as tea, and for some, just as regular. It was a prescription for the mind when the city's clamour, its endless horse hooves and hawkers, had wound you too tightly. For businessmen with throbbing temples after a day in the counting house, for widows whose grief had stretched past the polite period of mourning, for factory workers whose bodies couldn't rest even when the whistle had blown. The first effect was not a rush but a softening, a lightness at the edges of thought, as though your worries had been moved to another room. The gaslight seemed warmer, the fire more companionable. The armchair held you a little closer. Time loosened its grip, the clock ticking less like a hammer, more like a lullaby. Under its influence, conversation shifted. People spoke more slowly, but with greater care. Disagreements lost their heat. Laughter found its way into quieter moments. Anxieties that had seemed insurmountable in the morning became curious puzzles by evening. Even the wallpaper, the busy, overstuffed florals so fashionable then seemed less oppressive, as if it had decided not to crowd you after all. For those in pain, cannabis tincture offered another gift distraction without detachment. A soldier nursing an old wound might find himself staring at the hearth, remembering not the ache in his leg but the sound of rain on canvas. A seamstress with aching fingers might hum along with the street music drifting in from outside. Forgetting the days, hours bent over cloth, doctors prescribed it freely, for ailments that today would be called stress, anxiety, insomnia, or depression, though the Victorians preferred gentler terms like nervous exhaustion or melancholia. Mothers gave it to restless children. Husbands kept a bottle on the sideboard for their wives. There was no scandal in it. It was medicine, and medicine was respectable. But not everyone took it purely for health. In certain drawing rooms, after the tea had been cleared, a bottle might be brought out for a small restorative. Guests would lean back into their chairs, the fire crackling, as the evening stretched into a comfortable haze. The stories grew slower, but more detailed, filled with digressions about childhood summers, lost loves, and the philosophy of happiness. Someone might even quote poetry, not for the performance, but for the pleasure of hearing the words aloud. In that softened state, the boundaries of the self felt thinner. You could think about your own life with more generosity, forgive small slights, and remember that everyone was carrying their own invisible burdens. It was not the wild abandon of gin, nor the sharp inspiration of absinthe. It was something quieter, a shift of focus. Life was still there in all its complexity, but the harshness had been blurred, the volume turned down. Of course, some disapproved. Temperance advocates lumped cannabis tincture with the other soft poisons of the era, warning that it dulled ambition and sapped moral strength. There were stories, a half-truth, half-gossip, about artists who'd spent weeks in a state of mental drift after overindulging. But for most, it was just another tool in the cabinet, taken as needed and left alone when life was steady. Its legality was its shield. No one whispered about it the way they did about opium dens or ether parties. No one raided the shops that sold it. And so, for decades, cannabis tincture kept its place on the apothecary shelves, a quiet green bottle among the more flamboyant remedies of the Victorian age. If you took it alone, late at night, the world outside your window seemed to breathe more slowly. The fog that curled around the street lamps was not menacing but companionable. You might find yourself staring at the patterns in the wallpaper, tracing the vines and blossoms until they seemed to shift under your gaze. In that moment, it was easy to believe that the world could be kinder than it was, that you could be kinder than you had been. And when the cork went back into the bottle, the effect didn't vanish all at once. It lingered, like the afterglow of a good conversation, or the memory of a warm day. The morning might come with its usual demands. The factory whistle, the market's noise, the tapping at the office door but for a few more hours. The edges of life would remain just a little softer. The wallpaper, for now, would keep its peace. Its turbo mode with a skull on the label. The bottle is squat and square, the glass thick enough to survive a fall from a counter. The liquid inside is the colour of oversteeped tea, and the label is a curious mix of invitation and threat. In looping Victorian script, it promises renewed vigour, restored appetite, and increased stamina for the weak and convalescent. And then, right below the flourish, a small to stark drawing of a skull and crossbones. That's because this isn't a tonic in the modern sense. This is strychnia poison in the same league as arsenic diluted and bottled as a pick-me-up for those who felt life slipping from their fingers. The Victorians called it a nervous system stimulant. They believed that in just the right amount, it could wake the body's machinery, sharpen the senses, and give the frail a fighting chance. In an era where fatigue could be fatal, where an infection or long illness might leave you too weak to work and too poor to eat, people were willing to gamble. A few drops of this vitalizer in water, and within minutes you felt your pulse quicken, your skin tingle, your mind sharpen. The room seemed brighter, the air clearer. The lethargy that had weighed you down all winter fell away like an old coat. Athletes of the time swore by it. Marathoners and cyclists took strychnine tonics before grueling races, claiming it gave them the steady, iron endurance of a steam engine. It didn't make the pain vanish, it made the pain feel irrelevant. Muscles that had been close to giving up suddenly found a second wind. Your heart would hammer, your lungs would open, and for a few shining hours, you felt more alive than you had in years. But strychnine wasn't just for sport. For the respectable classes, it was prescribed after illness, to restore appetite and promote circulation. Doctors gave it to aging businessmen whose hands trembled at the breakfast table, to young mothers who couldn't shake the exhaustion after childbirth, to soldiers returning from war with their nerves shot to pieces. It was the Victorian answer to burnout, a way to snatch energy from the very edge of danger. The danger was never far. Too much strychnine, and the same tonic that made you feel like a racehorse would twist every muscle in your body into knots. The poison worked on the spinal cord, turning every nerve signal into a whip crack. A fatal dose could lock your jaw shut, arch your back until it snapped, and stop your breathing in a matter of minutes. The skull on the label wasn't decorative. It was a warning to respect the line between cure and corpse. Still, the allure was powerful. In a world without coffee shops on every corner, without energy drinks and vitamin shots, strychnine was the closest thing to an instant transformation. For the man who'd been trudging through his days, it was a sudden return to youth. For the woman fading from nervous exhaustion, it was a reminder that her heart could still race for reasons other than fear. In the grand Victorian pharmacy, strychnine tonics were often displayed alongside the other heroic medicine-sopium mixtures, chloral hydrates, coca wines. The bottles caught the light in their polished wood cabinets, each one a promising glass. Customers didn't see them as dangerous indulgences. They were investments in productivity, in one more season of work, in one more year of feeling useful. There was a kind of moral dimension to it, too. The Victorians prized energy as proof of character. To be sluggish was to risk being thought lazy, and laziness was a moral failing. Strychnine let you rise from bed when you might otherwise have stayed under the covers. It gave you the sparkle in your eyes that told employers, friends, and family, I am strong, I am capable, I am still in the game. In sporting circles, its use was almost ritualized. Before a race, an athlete might sit in a dim changing room, the smell of liniment in the air, holding a glass with a few measured drops of the tonic swirling in water. Teammates would nod. This was part of the preparation, like lacing your shoes or tightening your belt. The taste was sharp and bitter, but the effect was worth it. Once the starting gun cracked, the strychnine kicked in, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of feet and breath. But for every victory it fueled, there were whispered stories of collapses men who'd overestimated their tolerance, who'd pushed too far past the line. Inquests occasionally revealed heart failure following excessive use of nerve stimulants. Doctors would shake their heads, but the bottles remained on the shelves. It was, in the end, a perfect reflection of the Victorian spirit, industrious, ambitious, and willing to take risks that modern sensibilities would find unthinkable. To live at full tilt, even if the fuel was dangerous. To push the machinery of the body right to the edge, trusting that the gears would hold. And in the quiet after the tonic wore off, there was often a reckoning. The pulse slowed, the fatigue returned, sometimes doubled. Muscles ached in new ways. The skull on the label, ignored in the flush of vitality, seemed to watch you from the nightstand, reminding you that the fairy godmother of energy had a scythe tucked under her skirts. Yet the next morning, for many, the choice was easy. The world still demanded more than they felt they had to give, and so the cork came out. The tonic splashed into the glass, and once again, the heart leapt into dangerous, exhilarating motion. Completely safe, they say, non-addictive, They promise. The label is printed in a font so elegant it could belong to a chocolate box. Gold leaf curls at the corners. The words, "For persistent cough," sit under a tidy illustration of a woman wrapped in a shawl, gazing out a frost-rimmed window. It doesn't look dangerous. It doesn't even look like medicine. This is heroin cough syrup, as the Victorians knew it, marketed as the modern, safe alternative to morphine. The pitch was simple. Morphine was falling out of favour among the respectable classes, whispered about in connection with dependency, war injuries, and ruined reputations. Heroin, discovered and refined by biochemists in the late 19th century, was advertised as cleaner, gentler, without the unpleasant after-effects, a scientific miracle for the chest, the nerves, and the conscience. It was poured into amber bottles, measured in teaspoons, and kept next to the sugar for tea. Mothers gave it to children who couldn't stop coughing through the night. Clerks took it in the morning to keep from hacking their way through an important meeting. It slipped into the rhythm of daily life so easily that many forgot it was anything more than sweet, syrupy relief, and sweet it was. The thick liquid clung to the spoon, tasted faintly of licorice or honey, and spread a slow, soothing warmth down the throat. Within minutes, the cough stopped, not softened, not reduced, but gone entirely. Along with the cough went the ache in the ribs, the scratch in the throat, and, most unexpectedly, the sharp edges of thought, worry, irritation, and sorrow seemed to slide to the far corners of the mind, as if the medicine had tidied the mental room while tending to the lungs. For the exhausted parent or the overworked shopkeeper, this was a blessing. The nights became quiet again. The mornings began without dread. Those who had spent weeks fighting consumption or bronchitis now felt capable of returning to work, to church, to conversation. The syrup didn't just remove the symptom, it gave people back a version of themselves they preferred. Doctors prescribed it freely, with genuine conviction that it was safe. The medical journals of the time praised its efficiency, an ideal sedative for the respiratory tract, lacking the undesirable properties of morphine. Few stopped to consider that heroin was simply morphine in a slightly different chemical dress on, that happened to cross the brain's thresholds more quickly, more powerfully. The social respectability of heroin cough syrup was part of its charm. You could pour a spoonful in company without the raised eyebrows that laudanum or gin might attract. Guests might even request it, half joking, as the only cordial worth keeping in the cupboard. In middle-class homes, it became a quiet staple, part of the household pharmacy alongside patent tonics and digestive powders. But for some, the syrup became more than a cure. It became a way to step outside the reach of life's demands. The shop's debts, the landlord's visits, the empty chair at the family table. A teaspoon could make them all less urgent, less cutting. Not gone, but blurred enough to be bearable. This was the other promise of heroin, the one left out of the advertisements, not just the end of pain, but the end of caring about pain. For the widow alone in her kitchen, for the clerk watching the years pile up with nothing to show, for the factory worker whose cough came back every winter, this absence of care felt almost holy. It was a dangerous holiness, because when the dose wore off, the cough often returned with a sharper edge, and so did the heaviness of life. The easiest solution was another spoonful. The body learned to expect it. The mind began to prefer the softened world. And slowly, quietly, the line between medicine and need disappeared. By the turn of the century, whispers began to surface. Physicians noticed patients who returned again and again for refills. Long after the cough was gone, families spoke of loved ones who seemed dimmed, their days drifting in syrupy calm. A few bolder voices warned that this non-addictive marvel was perhaps too good at what it did. The warnings didn't stop the sales knot at first. The Victorian faith in progress, in chemistry, in the idea that every problem could be solved in a bottle, was too strong, and heroin cough syrup was, in its own way, the perfect Victorian product, modern, elegant, effective, and just dangerous enough to be thrilling for those who knew. When you picture it now, it's easy to imagine the scene, the bottle on the breakfast table, the light filtering through its amber glass, the spoon resting beside it, a family going about their morning, one child buttoning his coat, another stirring porridge, the mother pouring just enough syrup to keep the day quiet, no one thinking of it as a vice, no one imagining the shadow it could cast. In that moment, It was simply relief in a world where relief was rare and expensive. It was kindness in liquid form, even if the kindness had a price that would be collected later. And so, people kept taking it, because when the alternative was coughing yourself awake in a damp bed, with no fire and no hope of sleep, a little sweetness in the spoon was worth whatever future it mortgaged. Safe for all ages, they insisted. The tin is painted in cheerful colours, soft blues and buttery yellows, the kind that belong on a child's toy. In the centre, a round-cheeked boy with perfect Victorian curls holds one of the lozenges between his fingers, poised to pop it into his mouth. He looks serene, maybe even proud, as though he's about to do something grown-up and important. The script along the edge reads, "Guaranteed relief for coughs, hoarseness and sore throat." No mention of what made them work so well. These were opium cough drops, a confection that bridged the gap between medicine and treat. The Victorians, in their infinite optimism about science and sweets, decided that the best way to deliver pain relief and calm was through something pleasant to hold in the mouth. If you could wrap a narcotic in sugar and peppermint, then surely it couldn't be anything but wholesome. For parents, these lozenges were a godsend. Children who coughed through the night from croup, bronchitis, or just a stubborn winter chill could finally sleep, and so could everyone else in the house. No messy spoonfuls of bitter syrup, no wrestling to make them swallow something unpleasant. Just a piece of candy, to be sucked slowly until the noise stopped, and it always stopped. The first thing you noticed when the lozenge touched your tongue was the cooling mint or honey flavour. Then, beneath that, a strange, almost floral note that lingered in the nose as much as the mouth. The texture was smooth, designed to melt evenly so every second brought another tiny wave of relief. Within minutes, the harsh rasp of a cough softened, the throat stopped aching, and an almost dreamy calm began to spread. For a child, the sensation was magic comfort arriving without scolding or fuss. For adults, it was something subtler. These drops didn't just quiet the throat, they smoothed the edges of thought. The headache of the day eased, the tension in the shoulders melted. Conversation came slower, gentler. This, of course, was the work of the opium. Each drop carried enough to not only calm the cough but also to still the mind. It was a chemical lullaby, disguised in the harmless form of candy. The dose was small, but the effect, especially for children, could be profound. A restless, fussy toddler could be transformed into an angelic sleeper within half an hour. And so the drops became a staple. A tin might sit on the mantel, next to the clock and the family photographs. Guests could help themselves without shame. These were medicine, after all. On cold evenings, they might be passed around with the tea biscuits. The line between dose and treat blurred so completely that few thought to question it. The advertisements leaned into this comfort. Illustrated ladies in winter shawls smiled over steaming cups of tea, a tin of drops on the table beside them. Testimonials claimed the drops worked without the least ill effect and were suitable for young and old alike. The words safe, gentle, and natural appeared again and again, as if repetition alone could make them true. But for all the marketing, the truth was that opium did not care about age. The same chemical that quieted a cough could slow breathing to dangerous levels, especially in the very young or the frail. A child given too many drops in quick succession might simply drift off and fail to wake again. And because the drops were so pleasant, so easy to take, the risk of overindulgence was far higher than with bitter syrups or foul-tasting powders. Some doctors began to notice the pattern. Letters appeared in medical journals, couched in the cautious language of the time concerns about overuse in domestic settings, prolonged somnolence in children, dependency of the nervous system upon opiate relief. But the tins stayed on the shelves. The public trusted the labels more than the warnings. In a way, the cough drops embodied the Victorian paradox, a deep belief in progress and modern convenience, paired with a willingness to ignore the costs if the immediate benefit was sweet enough. They turned a dangerous drug into something portable, palatable, and most insidiously social. Imagine a winter evening in a small parlour. A fire crackles in the grate, the air scented with coal smoke and peppermint. A father reaches for the tin, passes it to his daughter, then takes one for himself. They sit in companionable quiet, each letting the lozenge dissolve in their mouth. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the silence is complete, almost sacred. It's easy to see why people loved them, easy to see how they became part of the fabric of home life, and it's just as easy to see how they lulled an entire society into thinking that comfort could be plucked from a candy tin without consequence. By the time the dangers were undeniable, when public health campaigns began to warn of opium's addictive grip, the habit was already generations deep. The tins vanished from shop windows, replaced by milder, opium-free lozenges that tasted almost the same but never worked quite as well. People missed them in the way they missed an old lullaby, even if they knew it hadn't been good for them. In the end, the opium cough drop was more than a remedy. It was a lesson, though one learned far too late that the sweetest comforts are sometimes the most treacherous. That even in the innocence of childhood flavours, there can be shadows that stretch far into the night. Wellness isn't about kale, it's about port. At least, that's how a great many Victorians would have told it, with a wink and a top-up of their glass, in an age when medicine and pleasure often shared the same bottle. Doctor's orders could be the most delightful prescription you'd hear all year. Brandy for the chest, port for the blood, whiskey for the nerves. If you were ill, it was all the more reason to pour generously, and if you weren't, well, better to take it as a preventative measure. The idea was rooted in something more than just indulgence. Alcohol, in the 19th century, was widely believed to be medicinal and energizer for the weak, a sedative for the anxious, a stimulant for the heart, a tonic for the blood. Every respectable household kept a small selection for health purposes, and every respectable doctor knew when to recommend it, which, in many cases, was frequently... Picture the scene: a middle-class sitting room on a winter evening. The patient, pale and bundled in blankets, sits near the fire. A decanter of brandy rests on the side table, catching the glow of the flames. The doctor, after a brief and entirely formal examination, announces that what's needed is a tablespoon of brandy and warm milk, 3 times daily. This is delivered with the authority of science, as if the dose has been carefully calculated rather than chosen for its agreeable taste. And once the doctor leaves, that tablespoon might quietly expand to a generous pour. After all, if a little is good for the constitution, surely more is better. The Victorian approach to medicinal alcohol was as much about morale as medicine. A small drink before bed soothed the nerves and made the night sleep deeper. A tot of port in the afternoon warmed the body and strengthened the blood. Whiskey fiery, unashamed, could be relied upon to bring a flush to the cheeks of even the most exhausted invalid. It wasn't just for the sick. Mothers were told to take a little sherry to keep up their strength while nursing. Factory workers were encouraged to have beer with lunch to maintain energy through the long shift. In hospitals, alcohol was part of the regular supplies, doled out to patients recovering from surgery or wasting illnesses. It was a form of comfort care, yes, but also a way of marking the moment you were being tended to, looked after, restored. Doctors themselves were often enthusiastic advocates, not only for the physical benefits, but for the emotional lift. Medicine at the time was as much about soothing the mind as treating the body, and a little warmth in the throat could do wonders for a patient's outlook. Many prescriptions for brandy or port were less about chemistry than about kindness, a way to give the patient something pleasurable when life had turned cold and clinical. The line between medical use and recreational drinking blurred quickly. A bottle of tonic port might be finished in days rather than weeks. A gentleman prescribed whiskey for his gout might discover that his limp felt particularly bad at the start of each evening, and those who had never set foot in a doctor's office could still justify their nightly drink as a form of self-prescribed preventive medicine. The marketing leaned into this dual identity. Advertisements for fortified wines and spirits boasted of their restorative properties, often accompanied by images of hale, rosy-cheeked men and women. Port was recommended by physicians for the delicate, brandy for those in recovery, and whiskey to stimulate the constitution. A good bottle was as important in the medicine cabinet as it was in the dining room. There was, of course, a darker side. In poorer districts, cheap spirits became a way to dull hunger, to keep warm in homes with thin walls and no coal for the fire. Alcohol dependence flourished quietly under the guise of doctor-approved use, and while some physicians warned of overindulgence, many were reluctant to deprive patients of one of the few accessible comforts in a world with limited remedies and plenty of hardship. Still, in the drawing rooms and parlours of the middle and upper classes, medicinal alcohol retained its respectability. A lady could accept a glass of sherry at midday without risk to her reputation, if it was for her health. A clergyman might recommend port to ailing parishioners without fear of impropriety. In this way, alcohol moved through every layer of Victorian society, sanctioned by science, sustained by custom, and sweetened by the simple fact that it felt good. And there was ritual to it, too. The measured pour, the warm glass between the hands, the first sip blooming in the chest. These small acts made the patient feel attended to, not just in the medical sense, but in the human one. Illness, isolated people, a shared drink brought them back into the fold, even if only for the span of a conversation by the fire. It's easy to imagine the satisfaction of those evenings. The invalid in the armchair, the visitor leaning in to tell a story, the decanter quietly emptying as the night wears on. Outside, the streets are slick with rain. Inside, the air smells of polished wood, pipe smoke, and the faint sweet burn of port. Somewhere between the second and third glass, the lines of worry on the patient's face soften. Not gone, never gone, but blurred enough to let the laughter in. By the dawn of the 20th century, the medical profession began to retreat from its blanket endorsement of alcohol as cure-all. Studies questioned its actual therapeutic value. Temperance movements gained strength, casting a moral shadow over what had once been a respectable prescription. Yet for decades afterward, the memory of medicinal port and doctor's whiskey lingered, wrapped in the same golden light that filtered through those old decanters. For the Victorians, health was never purely about the body. It was about the spirit, both the inner kind and the kind that came in a bottle, and sometimes the two were tiny, shiny, perfectly round, and probably not good for you. That was the paradox of mercury pills in the Victorian age. They looked like health. They were sold as health, and yet they carried a kind of silent, shimmering menace in every dose. In a world where medical science was still trying to decide whether bad air or bad morals made you sick, mercury had a strange allure. It gleamed. It moved like quicksilver liquid metal that seemed to defy nature. And if something could behave so mysteriously in a glass vial, surely it must have the power to transform the body as well. These little pills were crafted to be beautiful, almost ornamental, about the size of a pea. Each one was smooth to the touch and glinted faintly under lamplight. They came in small glass bottles or delicate tins, with labels that promised purification, restoration, and balance of the humours. The language was vague, but that was the point. The pill could be for headaches, or indigestion, or fevers, or joint pain, or nervous complaints, a wonderfully elastic term that covered anything from anxiety to sheer boredom with life. The theory, such as it was, rested on mercury's ability to drive out impurities. Taken in small amounts, it was believed to stimulate the system, purge bad elements, and restore vitality. For centuries, mercury had been used to treat syphilis, not because it worked particularly well, but because it did something. Patients sweated, salivated, and felt as though they were undergoing a dramatic internal cleansing. This visible, almost theatrical reaction convinced many Victorians that the substance was burning away illness from the inside. Of course, what it was actually burning away was the body itself. Mercury is toxic even in small amounts, and repeated doses could lead to tremors, tooth loss, memory loss, and eventually organ failure. But these effects came on slowly, sometimes over years, which made it easy to blame them on other ailments, old age, or just constitutional weakness. Imagine the ritual of taking one. You sit at a small table, the bottle in front of you. Perhaps the label bears the name of a London apothecary or a respected patent medicine company. You tap one pill into your palm. It's cold and solid, as if holding a drop of frozen moonlight. You swallow it with a sip of water, or more likely, a sip of something stronger, because doctors' orders can always be improved upon. Then you wait. Within a few hours, you might feel a warmth in your belly, or a slight quickening of the pulse. This was taken as proof that the pill was working, that the gleam on its surface was now mirrored inside you, polishing away the dullness of ill health. If you were unwell, the symptoms might ebb briefly, only to return later, at which point another pill would be taken, and another, and another. Mercury pills were not just medicine, they were status. To afford them meant you could consult a physician, purchase from a reputable chemist, and follow a treatment regimen. The poor relied on home remedies and folk cures. The well-to-do had science, or what passed for it, delivered in these elegant little orbs. And the irony was that the richer you were, the more likely you were to suffer from long-term mercury poisoning simply because you could afford to take more of it. The advertisements leaned heavily on refinement. No lurid promises or garish illustrations, here mercury pills were sold with an air of quiet confidence. The packaging suggested discretion, as if to say, this is not a desperate cure for the masses. This is the private, dignified way to reclaim your health. There was a sort of social comfort in taking something that looked and felt expensive, and yet, behind the elegance was danger. A tremor in the hand, once dismissed as nerves, might become permanent. The gums might swell and bleed, the once sharp mind might begin to fog. In some cases, the skin itself would take on a peculiar pallor, a subtle greyish sheener cruel mirror of the metallic cure within. But for many Victorians, these side effects were simply accepted as the price of living long enough to develop them. It's worth remembering that this was an age when most medicines were, at best, educated guesses. People had no antibiotics, no vaccines for common killers, no modern understanding of germs. Illness was often a matter of fate, and so any treatment that made you feel different, whether through relief, stimulation, or even discomfort, was valued. If the pill caused a reaction, it meant the pill was potent, and potency was what people trusted. In the glow of the lamplight, a mercury pill could seem almost magical. Its surface reflected the room around it, the brass candlesticks, the mahogany table, the pale hands of the one holding it. It was easy to imagine that such a perfect little sphere must contain the key to restoring one's own shine, that by swallowing it, you could take a piece of that silvery perfection into yourself, making the inside match the outside. But mercury has a way of keeping its own counsel. It doesn't shout its damage, it whispers it over time, rearranging the body functions in ways that only become clear when it's too late. And so, these pills, beautiful as they were, became quiet accomplices in countless slow declines. Even now, it's hard not to be drawn in by the image, the glint of the pill in the palm, the faint clink as it drops into a glass vial, the promise written in looping script on a cream-coloured label. The Victorians trusted them because they looked like health, because they felt like action, because they carried the romance of alchemy turning metal into medicine, decay into restoration. They never quite learned that the shine on the surface wasn't a reflection of life returning, but of life slipping quietly away, and by the time they did, the damage was already done. Everyone inhales, just not always common sense. That was the Victorian way with tobacco. It was everywhere, in every form, moving through every layer of society like the very smoke it produced. It wasn't just a habit, it was a social glue, a rhythm in the day, a sign of belonging, whether it came as the sweet curl of cigar smoke after dinner, the dry rasp of a cigarette between hurried conversations, or the gritty pinch of snuff discreetly tapped from a silver box. Tobacco was as much about connection as it was about nicotine. You couldn't escape it. Step into a coffee house in London and the air would already be thick with it before you'd even found a seat. Pipe smoke clung to the rafters, trapped there by years of the same conversation, politics, trade, scandal, whether each remark punctuated by a puff. The man next to you might be a banker, the one beyond him a dock worker, but for a moment the smoke levelled them both. Here, status dissolved into the haze, and tobacco did what polite society often could not, it closed the gap. In drawing rooms, the mood shifted. Cigars ruled here, slow and deliberate, each one lit with ceremony after a heavy dinner. The scent was richer, the smoke thicker, the pace unhurried. Men sat back in deep leather chairs, voices dropping to a comfortable rumble, as if the tobacco itself demanded more thoughtful conversation. Politics and business deals were sealed in that warm fog, the smoke acting like mortar between bricks. The women had withdrawn to another room. Tobacco was still considered largely a male domain in these settings, but in private, some ladies also indulged, especially in the form of snuff, the powdered tobacco that could be taken with elegance and without the stigma of a lit cigar. Snuff had its own choreography. A gentleman might draw out a small ornate box from his waistcoat pocket, flick it open with practiced ease, and offer a pinch to a companion. The recipient would take it between thumb and forefinger, inhale sharply, and then sneeze often spectacularly. It was as much performance as pleasure, and the shared act broke through formal barriers. In that sneeze, for a moment, You weren't a lord or a lawyer, you were just a man with watering eyes and a need for a handkerchief. On the streets, cigarettes were becoming the democratic choice. Cheap, portable, and quick. They were the smoke of the restless and the working class, perfect for stealing a few moments during a break or while walking between errands. Rolling tobacco was sold in paper packets, and skilled hands could twist one into shape in seconds. Matches struck against rough brick walls, the flare lighting up tired faces before the first drag blurred them again in shadow. Tobacco was a marker of time as much as of place. A pipe in the morning to start the day, a cigar after dinner to mark its end. Cigarettes to punctuate the hours in between. In factories, workers timed their breaks by the length of a smoke. In gentlemen's clubs, conversations stretched as long as the cigars burned, winding down only when the ash dropped to the carpet. The day was measured in the rising and falling of smoke. It was also a currency of sorts. Offering a cigarette could open a conversation with a stranger. Sharing a cigar was a mark of trust. Passing the snuff box was an invitation into one's personal circle. In this way, tobacco wasn't just consumed, it was exchanged, gifted, and used as a social tool. To refuse an offer was to risk appearing aloof. To accept was to acknowledge a bond, however temporary. And yet, for all its civility in certain contexts, tobacco was just as much at home in rougher ones. In pubs, the air was a dense soup of pipe and cigarette smoke, and the smell clung to your clothes for days. In sailors' quarters, tobacco was chewed, spit into buckets, and lit in cramped bunks. At fairs and markets, smoke mingled with the scent of fried food and damp wool. It blurred the edges of the world, making every scene feel both more alive and slightly less real. For many, tobacco was a kind of portable comfort. The first puff in the morning could feel like the day's true beginning, the last one at night like a closing ritual. In the cold, it warmed the lungs. In moments of frustration, it steadied the hands. It gave people something to do while they thought, something to hold when they had nothing else to say. And for soldiers, sailors, and factory workers, it was a small, steady luxury in lives, often short on them. Doctors, of course, rarely objected. Some even recommended tobacco for digestion or to settle the nerves. Advertisements promoted its virtues, sometimes claiming it could ward off illness. There were no warnings on the packets, no whispered concerns about cancer. The only real caution was about excess too much could make you dizzy, though even that was sometimes considered part of the fun. The soundscape of tobacco was its own kind of music, the soft crackle of burning leaf, the rhythmic tap of a pipe against a table to clear the bowl, the faint snap of a match, followed by the hiss as it caught, and then, always, the long exhale, the visible sigh of someone retreating a little from the present moment. In hindsight, it's easy to see the cost, the hacking coughs, the stained fingers, the shortened lives. But in the Victorian moment, tobacco was about something bigger than health. It was about camaraderie, ritual, and the simple, primal pleasure of drawing in smoke and letting it drift away again. It connected people across classes, across conversations, across the small and large distances of daily life. Every inhale carried a piece of someone else's day, the cobbler's worries, the banker's schemes, the sailor's songs, and every exhale sent a part of your own into the crowd. It was an exchange, invisible yet binding, carried on the air and woven into the very fabric of Victorian life. Stop if you begin to dream in black and white. That was the quiet warning passed between patients, usually with a half smile that suggested it was only half a joke. In Victorian Britain, bromide was the respectable way to take the edge off a chemical lullaby prescribed by doctors, poured into powders, tablets, or tonics, and meant to smooth the sharp corners of life. If laudanum was the poetic escape and gin the chaotic release, bromide was the chemical equivalent of politely excusing yourself from the conversation and shutting the door. It came into vogue in the mid-19th century, marketed as a marvel of modern nerve science. Physicians prescribed it for everything under the vast umbrella of nervous conditions, anxiety, insomnia, irritability, seizures, and even sexual overexcitement, a term so vague it could apply to anything from a restless honeymooner to a man who tapped his fingers too much at dinner. Bromide was safe, they said, because it wasn't addictive. You could take it every night without fear of developing habits like those unfortunate souls on morphine or opium, and people believed it. The truth was less reassuring. Bromide didn't inspire dreams of velvet-draped opium dens or glittering green fairies. It simply dulled you. It took the sting out of panic, the heat out of anger, and if taken long enough, the colour out of life itself. One moment you were tossing in bed, replaying an argument or an unpaid bill in your head, and the next you were staring at the same ceiling, but without the energy to care. Problems didn't feel solved, they simply felt irrelevant. This was part of its charm. In an age of unrelenting noise, horse hooves on cobblestones, the hiss of steam engines, the clatter of factory looms bromide offered a rare and private quiet. You didn't need to leave the city or retreat to the countryside. You could find your calm in a glass of water stirred with a few chalky crystals. For the respectable classes, bromide was the perfect compromise between health and indulgence. Alcohol might loosen your tongue and invite social disgrace. Opium might stain your name if it came out that you used it for more than the occasional cough. But bromide was prescribed by your doctor, written neatly in his ledger, and dispensed by a chemist who would nod knowingly as he measured out your dose. No scandal there, just good. Modern medicine for the frayed and overwrought. You might begin with a small nightly dose. Perhaps you told yourself it was just to break a bad cycle of sleeplessness. The powder dissolved in water with a faint mineral taste. Not unpleasant, not memorable. Within an hour, the body would unclench, the mind's buzzing would dim to a low hum, and sleep would arrive not as a surrender but as a gentle suggestion. You would wake feeling calmer than you'd been in weeks, and perhaps a little slower, as though thoughts were taking the scenic route to your mouth. But bromide had a way of lingering. The more often you took it, the more it blurred the edges between days. You might forget small details, a name, a place you'd meant to goonly to find that the forgetting itself didn't bother you much. Even the sharp emotional peaks and valleys began to flatten. A triumph at work felt nice. A quarrel with a neighbour felt manageable, and slowly, you became the sort of person who could not be rattled, not because you had mastered your reactions, but because your reactions had been chemically filed down to nubs. For the Victorians, who often prized composure over passion, this was a selling point. Bromide made it easier to be stoic, unflappable, appropriately detached. It was a chemical ally in the performance of respectability. Husbands praised it for keeping their wives' nerves steady. Wives encouraged their husbands to take it after long days in the counting house. Parents quietly administered it to restless adult sons who worried them with their excesses. And yet, as the months or years went by, a subtle transformation took place. Users began to look washed out. Not ill exactly, but drained, as if the vibrancy had been leached from their eyes and skin. This was bromisma condition brought on by chronic bromide use, marked by lethargy, depression, and, in advanced cases, hallucinations. The black and white dreams were one of the earliest signs of vivid, unsettling visions without colour, as though the brain itself had lost the memory of the light. Some patients reported feeling as if they were walking through life in those same monochrome shades, unable to shake the sense that the world had dimmed. Doctors, of course, debated the risks. Some argued that these symptoms were rare, confined to people who took excessive doses. Others quietly acknowledged that they were seeing it more often than they'd expected. But bromide was easy to prescribe and easy to take, and for many physicians, the promise of immediate relief outweighed the distant threat of slow corrosion. For the patient, the choice was even simpler. In a time when most medicines worked through violence purging, bleeding, blistering bromide was gentle. It didn't make you vomit, sweat, or faint. It didn't taste like poison. It didn't burn going down. It just made things easier. And for someone living through the relentless pace and pressure of the Victorian age, easier was often enough. There's a scene that might have played out in countless middle-class parlours across Britain. A man comes home late from work, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. His wife sets a glass in front of him, not brandy, not tea, just a little cloudy water. He drinks it without comment. Within an hour, the air in the room feels lighter, the ticking of the mantel clock less insistent. They sit together in companionable silence, neither mentioning the unpaid bill or the awkward dinner invitation from the neighbours. By bedtime, neither remembers to. Bromide didn't inspire poetry or legend. It wasn't the stuff of bohemian rebellion or sailors' tall tales, but it shaped lives all the same, not by adding drama, but by quietly subtracting it. It made survival smoother, conversation softer, tempers cooler, and if it also dulled joy, well, that was the trade some were willing to make. In the end, the warning about the black and white dreams was more than a joke. It was a quiet recognition of bromide's true power not to heal, not to cure, but to mute, to turn the full orchestra of human feeling into a low, steady hum you could live beside without strain. In that steady hum, people found a kind of peace through apathy, peace through forgetting, and for many in the Victorian night, that was all they wanted. The parish council is suddenly founding an orphanage. That was the sort of thing people joked about when coca wine specifically, Vin Mariani, started making the rounds in Victorian Britain. Decisions were bolder, conversations livelier, charitable projects more ambitious. It wasn't divine inspiration, though some might have claimed it. It was the coca leaf, steeped in Bordeaux wine, working its strange alchemy on the human mind. Vin Mariani was the invention of a French chemist named Angelo Mariani, who claimed to have perfected the art of extracting the stimulating essence of the coca leaf, the same plant that had energized Andean peoples for centuries, and marrying it to fine red wine. The result was a drink that seemed to deliver two blessings at once: the warmth and sociability of alcohol and the bright, electric clarity of cocaine, in a dose small enough to be considered medicinal, or at least socially acceptable. The Victorians, never ones to shy away from a productivity tool whether mechanical, moral, or chemical, embraced it. Mariani marketed his wine as a tonic for fatigue, a cure for melancholy, a remedy for shyness, and an enhancer of intellectual and physical performance, and his pitch worked. Clergymen, politicians, businessmen, and even the occasional monarch lent their names in endorsement. Popes drank it, writers swore by it, doctors prescribed it. Imagine the draw for a society obsessed with improvement, where every hour was meant to be filled with useful work or edifying leisure. You could sip a glass of Vin Mariani before tackling a daunting piece of correspondence, and suddenly the sentences came faster, the arguments sharper. A dull committee meeting became a flurry of ideas and decisions. The lethargy of a grey London afternoon dissolved into a buzzing determination to reorganise your desk, revise your ledgers, was proposed the founding of an orphanage. The taste itself was pleasant, even refined. Bordeaux brought its rich, familiar depth. The coca added a faint, bitter sharpness that hinted at the exotic. The first few sips were much like any fine wine, warm and mellow, but soon a subtle change began, quickening in the chest, a lightness in the limbs, as if gravity had loosened its grip. The mind, so often weighed down by the day's concerns, seemed suddenly aerodynamic. It was easy to see how a person might come to rely on it. In the age before endless cups of black coffee, Vin Mariani was a revelation stimulation without the jangling edge, clarity without the crash. For those in the public eye, it was a secret weapon. A speech seemed to write itself. A sermon gained a rhythm and force that congregants remembered for weeks. Artists painted with greater boldness. Musicians played with brighter energy. Even housewives, who were rarely the target audience for such tonics, found it useful for powering through the exhausting churn of domestic duties. Of course, not everyone drank it for noble reasons. In private clubs and salons, Vin Mariani was sometimes used less as a work aid and more as an amuse-bouche before a night of more serious drinking. It paired well with gossip and wit, turning quiet dinners into animated exchanges. Some claimed it removed the hesitations that kept certain conversations from starting at all. Others joked that it was truth serum in a bottle. But the truths revealed under its influence were often the kind that led to both opportunities and scandals. Mariani's marketing genius was to make Vin Mariani as much a status symbol as a beverage. The bottles were elegant, the labels dignified, and the endorsements lavish. He printed thick booklets of celebrity testimonials, glowing paragraphs from explorers, bishops, actors, and composers, until it seemed there was no walk of life that had not been improved by a glass or two. In an age hungry for both novelty and legitimacy, this was an irresistible combination. The dose of cocaine in each serving was not overwhelming, but it was enough to leave an imprint. Regular drinkers spoke of an odd sort of tired energy at the end of the day, a body ready for rest but a mind still running sprints. Some would take a second glass before bed to calm the mind with more wine, only to find the coca leaf pulling them back into a second wind. In the best cases, this meant evenings filled with reading, conversation, or late-night projects. In the worst, it meant lying awake until dawn, mind full of grand schemes that felt less grand in the grey light of morning. But even then, the solution was simple: another glass with breakfast. Like so many Victorian indulgences, Vin Mariani lived in the hazy borderland between medicine and pleasure. It was sold in chemists' shops and served in drawing rooms. It appeared in medical journals and on banquet tables. You could defend its use as a tonic for exhaustion, a prescription for neuralgia, or a way to sharpen the faculties before an important day. And if you happened to enjoy the way it made you feel like a more vivid version of yourself, well, that was just a happy side effect. There were, inevitably, those who warned of dangers. A few doctors noted that regular coca use could lead to dependence, and that combined with alcohol, its risks were amplified. They spoke of overstimulated hearts, frayed nerves, and the potential for quiet collapse after too many months of constant acceleration. But for most Victorians, the benefits seemed worth the gamble. Life was short, work was hard, and here was a liquid that seemed to make both more manageable. In a way, Vin Mariani embodied the era's contradictions. The Victorians were deeply moral yet endlessly experimental, cautious in manners but adventurous in science, concerned with appearances but hungry for results. Coca wine promised all three the moral high ground of self-improvement, the thrill of chemical innovation, and the visible glow of productivity. So when the parish council, or the literary society, or the ladies' charitable guild suddenly announced an ambitious new undertaking, the joke was always the same: someone must have brought a bottle of Vin Mariani to the last meeting. And beneath the laughter was a quiet, truthsome project. Some speeches, some bursts of boldness might never have happened without it. It wasn't a drink for those who wanted to forget. It was a drink for those who wanted to feel twice as alive, to push harder, to think faster, to be, for a few hours, the person they always wished they could be. And in that sense, it was as intoxicating to the ambition as it was to the body. Whether it left the world better or merely busier is harder to say. But in the glass, in the moment, with the coca leaf's whisper in your veins and the wine's warmth in your chest, it hardly mattered. The ideas felt sharper, the path clearer, the future brighter, and for a Victorian with too much to do and too little time, that was enough reason to raise another glass. You step off the cobblestones into the chemist's shop, and the first thing that greets you is the scent sharp, clean and faintly sweet, as if the air has been steeped in peppermint and soap. Shelves stand in neat military rows, stacked with blue glass bottles, paper packets, and tins stamped with gold lettering. Behind the counter, the chemist nods a polite welcome, adjusting his waistcoat with the same precision he measures powders. It all feels so respectable, proper, safe. That's the point. Victorian chemists lived on the knife edge between medicine and indulgence, between official prescriptions and the quiet trade of other remedies to those who knew how to ask. The front of the shop was for cough drops, liniments, and respectable tonics. The back. That was where the rules bent. It didn't happen for just anyone. You had to be a regular, someone the chemist could trust not to ruin him. That trust was earned over months, sometimes years. A man might begin by asking for a stronger laudanum than what was on the shelf. Then, perhaps, something for nerves that wasn't listed in the window. The chemist would study him closely, his clothes, his voice, the way he carried himself. Was this a man who could keep his mouth shut when the trust was finally there? The nod would come. That slight tilt of the head that meant you could follow him through the narrow doorway behind the counter. The air changed back there. The front room smelled like peppermint and starch. The back room smelled like camphor, damp wood, and something darker opium resin, perhaps, or the faint metallic tang of mercury pills waiting to be wrapped in paper twists. Light came from a single oil lamp that left the corners in shadow. Here. The glass bottles had no polite labels. Some bore nothing at all. Others carried handwritten notes in the chemist's own script for sleep, for pain, for courage. They were stored out of sight of inspectors, behind a curtain or inside a tall cabinet with a key only the chemist possessed. Men came in for many reasons. The labourer with a back ruined from loading crates wanted something stronger than gin to let him sleep without feeling the ache. The businessman with the twitch in his eye needed a stimulant that would keep him sharp through endless ledgers. The widow with the hollow stare wanted relief that was silent, heavy, and final enough to make the nights bearable. Each transaction was quick, discreet, and never discussed outside these walls. The chemist's role was as much social as it was chemical. He had to judge how much to give, and how often too little, and the customer might go to a rival too much, and the man might collapse in an alley, bringing the wrong kind of attention. It was a balancing act of morality and profit, laced with just enough deniability to keep the law at bay. Sometimes the back room was a place of negotiation. A customer might slide a few extra coins across the counter for something imported, the word carrying a wink. That might mean Parisian absinthe, morphine from Germany, or coca tincture from South America. These weren't things you stocked openly, they were kept in dark cupboards, brought out like contraband. The corks eased free as if the bottles themselves might tattle. And it wasn't only the poor or desperate who came. Clergymen, magistrates, even the occasional member of parliament. Anyone could find themselves in need of a remedy that didn't appear in public ledgers. They'd arrive in the early evening, after the shop closed to ordinary customers. A knock, a familiar voice, and the door would open just enough to let them slip inside. For the chemist, it was a business of precision, not just in measuring powders and liquids, but in measuring people. Who could be trusted with a strong laudanum, and who needed a gentler mixture that would still let them wake in the morning? Who was spiralling toward ruin and might drag you with them? And who would keep your secret for decades? On the shelves, in small corked bottles, were powders of every shade white for the quinine that kept fever at bay, amber for the chloral hydrate that softened the edges of a sleepless night, grey for the arsenic wafers that whitened the skin of the fashionable, each one measured on a brass scale so sensitive a single breath could sway the balance. And then there were the private preparations, those mixtures the chemist had devised himself, more potent, more direct, and often more dangerous than anything sold in the daylight. These recipes lived in a locked ledger, the handwriting so cramped and coded that even another chemist would have to guess at the doses. It was dangerous work. A single mistake could poison a man. A single loose tongue could ruin the shop. Yet the profits were undeniable. Backroom sales could double a chemist's income, and for many, the risk was simply part of the trade. There was an unspoken rule: you didn't ask why someone needed what they asked for. A man might request a bottle of ether and a length of silk ribbon. A woman might ask for laudanum and smelling salts in the same breath. The reasons belonged to them. Your job was to provide the means. On some nights, the back room felt almost like a club. Familiar faces, low voices, the clink of glass as small bottles changed hands. There was camaraderie here, a sense of being part of something just slightly outside the law, but entirely within the human need for relief from pain, from exhaustion, from grief, from the long Victorian day that never seemed to end. If the front of the shop was about health, the back was about mercy, and yet there was always the shadow, a man who took too much and didn't come back. A family who stopped calling after their son's medicine became a coffin. The chemist learned to live with these silences, to fold them into the cost of doing business, the way a ship's captain accepts that not every voyage will end with all hands safe. Years later, when laws tightened and inspectors grew bolder, many back rooms were closed for good. The cupboards were emptied, the ledgers burned, the doors sealed. But those who'd been there, who'd crossed that threshold from respectability into quiet indulgence, never forgot the feel of that dim room, the smell of cork and camphor, and the small, heavy bottle that carried more than medicine. Because in Victorian Britain, comfort often came in liquid form, and sometimes the only difference between a healer and a poisoner was which side of the counter you were standing on. The whistle blows, and 1,000 boots scrape across the factory floor. It's not the sound of relief, exactly, more the sound of machines releasing their grip on the human body for 30 blessed minutes. You follow the crowd into the lunchroom, a long, low hall that smells of coal dust, damp wool, and something faintly metallic, as if the air itself has been seasoned with iron filings. Men sit shoulder to shoulder on rough benches, their backs curved from hours of bending to machines that don't care if they're tired, cold, or alive. Tin lunch pails are cracked open in unison, releasing the scent of bread, cheese, and boiled meat. The food is simple. The hands that lift it are blistered and stained, nails blackened from oil that no soap can scrub out. But the real sustenance is not in the sandwiches. It's in the small bottles wrapped in cloth, tucked deep into the pails as if they were contraband, which, in truth, they often are. Laudanum for the man whose back screams from lifting all morning. Gin for the one who needs courage to return to the noise. Patent tonic for the pale-faced boy whose cough hasn't stopped in weeks, but who can't afford to miss a day. In the world outside, these bottles might be luxuries, indulgences for the weak-willed or the overly dramatic. In here, they're tools just as essential as the wrench, the hammer, the iron press. You watch as one man tips a measure of laudanum into his tea, stirring it with slow precision until the amber threads vanish into the brown. Another pours gin into his enamel mug, the scent sharp enough to cut through the smell of grease and sweat. There is no ceremony to it, no toast, just the quiet understanding that without this, the afternoon shift will be longer than the body can stand. Some men share. A sip passed along the bench, the glass wiped with a sleeve before it changes hands again, is not generosity exactly, it's survival. A man who shares today may need a mouthful from you tomorrow. The supervisors know, of course. They pretend they don't. As long as production doesn't slow, as long as the machines keep spinning, the bottles stay invisible. The irony is, many of these remedies are bought over the counter in the same respectable shops where wealthier Victorians buy their medicines. The difference is in the dose. What's soothing to a lady in her parlour might be functional to a man on the factory floor. That line between calm and incapacitated isn't drawn in textbooks, it's drawn in muscle aches and the weight of the next 10 hours. It's easy to romanticise the Victorian work ethic from a distance. The discipline, the endurance, the way men could stand 12 hours on their feet. Their bodies a blur of repetitive motion. But if you want the truth, you have to look at the lunchbox. You have to see the quiet desperation hidden between the bread and the cheese, the liquid that kept their hands steady when the machines threatened to eat them alive. Sometimes you catch fragments of conversation between sips, stories of accidents, the kind that happen when someone skips their medicine to save a few pennies and ends up too slow to dodge a belt drive. Laughter over a night when someone drank a little too much tonic and swore the machines were talking to him, and every now and then there's silence. A man staring into the bottom of his cup, knowing the bottle's nearly empty and payday is still 3 days off. You think the drink would make them sluggish, but often it's the opposite. A jolt of coca wine, a dose of strychnine tonic, and the body tightens into something almost mechanical. The ache's dull, the mind sharpens or perhaps just stops caring about the pain long enough to finish the day. For the women who work the looms and the presses, the bottles are smaller, easier to hide in aprons or sewing baskets. Laudanum is a favourite, it can be explained away as for the nerves or for monthly discomfort. In truth, it's for the grinding repetition, the deafening clatter, the way the hours drag like wet cloth. You notice, too, that the lunch break isn't entirely about rest. It's about adjusting the body settings, finding the right combination of bread, tea, and liquid courage to carry you back to the machines. Some men measure their doses to the drop. Others take what's left and hope for the best. When the whistle blows again, the bottles vanish as quickly as they appeared. Corks pressed tight, cloth-wrapped, tin lids snapped shut, the bench is empty, and the line of bodies flows back into the factory like water down a sluice. The air inside is hot and dry, filled with the roar of gears and the hiss of steam, but the men move differently now, some with renewed purpose. Others with that loose, unbothered gait that comes when the sharp edges of reality have been filed down. By evening, when the final whistle sounds, the day's doses will have worn off, the aches will return, heavier than before, the walk home will be slower, and tomorrow the cycle will begin again. Bread, cheese, a bottle hidden where no inspector will look. It's easy to say they should have worked without it. That willpower and grit should have been enough. But if you had to stand in that heat, that noise, that endless repetition, maybe you'd understand why the lunchbox was never just about food. Sometimes survival came in a sandwich, and sometimes it came in a bottle small enough to fit in your pocket, but strong enough to carry you through another day. The platform at midnight is not the place for daydreams. It's cold, damp, and restless, lit by gas lamps that flicker like they might go out at any moment, leaving everything to the moon and the shadows. The air tastes of coal dust and wet iron. Somewhere in the distance, an engine breathes in slow, heavy puffs, like a sleeping animal you're not sure you want to wake. You're here because the mail never sleeps. Neither do the men who carry it. The night mail train is the Empire's bloodstream letters, parcels, telegrams, banknotes, and news all moving through the veins of steel that stitch the country together. But to keep the blood moving, the men need something more than stubbornness. They need to stay awake in hours when the body begs to collapse. Inside the mail car, it's warm, but not comfortably so. The heat comes from the stove in the corner, its belly stuffed with coal, and from the bodies of men working in constant motion. Leather bags thump onto tables. Hands sort, stamp, and seal with the speed of habit. The rhythm is hypnotic thump, slide, stamp, toss, over and over, and that's the danger. At this hour, your mind starts drifting whether you want it to or not. The lights blur. The steady sway of the carriage turns into a lullaby you can't block out. That's when the bottles come out, not in a furtive, guilty way, but with the quiet practicality of a man checking the oil in a lamp, a measure of cocoa wine, a gulp of black coffee laced with laudanum haze. Laudanum, to take the edge off the speed, because too much speed can send the mind into strange, twitching places. A long draw from a pipe, the smoke curling through the air like ghostly handwriting. One man keeps a tin of patent invigorating lozenges in his pocket. They sparkle faintly when they catch the lamplight. A little alchemy of sugar, quinine, and something stronger that no one bothers to name. Another swears by chewing coca leaves straight, his jaw working slowly as the bitter taste sinks into his blood. They all have their rituals. Without them, the hours stretch and sag, pulling the work down with them. The conductor knows, of course. He takes his own medicine brandy in a silver hip flask, says it warms the bones and sharpens the mind, though by the time the train hits the next station, his voice has softened into that half-slurred calm that comes when the world stops feeling urgent. Outside, the countryside blurs into a dark watercolour as the train barrels through sleeping villages. In the mail car, men sort letters by flickering light, pausing only for a swallow from a bottle. This isn't just about staying awake, it's about staying sharp. Sometimes the stimulant runs too hot fast, breathless chatter and wide, glassy eyes. Sometimes too far the other way, a slow, syrupy nod. But the letters move, the bags empty and refill. By dawn, the car smells of paper, damp wool, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of cocoa wine. Victorian life called itself orderly, moral, and industrious. But behind the railways, factories, and punctual post was another fuel laudanum in teacups. Gin in the afternoon, cocoa wine at night. Medicine wasn't temptation, it was solution. Rich or poor, everyone learned the same truth: a tired body can be tricked. A restless mind softened. They didn't call it addiction. They called it getting through the day, and maybe, under the same soot-thick sky and bone-deep ache, you would have too. The bottles remain now in museums and antique shops' glass ghosts that once held comfort and poison in the same sip. Raise your glass tonight, not in praise, but in acknowledgement the distance between their age and ours is measured not just in years, but in which labels we choose to read and which we choose to ignore. Sleep well. Over and over, and that's the danger. At this hour, your mind starts drifting whether you want it to or not. The lights blur. The steady sway of the carriage turns into a lullaby you can't block out. That's when the bottles come out, not in a furtive, guilty way, but with the quiet practicality of a man checking the oil in a lamp, a measure of cocoa wine, a gulp of black coffee laced with laudanum haze. Laudanum, to take the edge off the speed, because too much speed can send the mind into strange, twitching places. A long draw from a pipe, the smoke curling through the air like ghostly handwriting. One man keeps a tin of patent invigorating lozenges in his pocket. They sparkle faintly when they catch the lamplight. A little alchemy of sugar, quinine, and something stronger that no one bothers to name. Another swears by chewing coca leaves straight, his jaw working slowly as the bitter taste sinks into his blood. They all have their rituals. Without them, the hours stretch and sag, pulling the work down with them. The conductor knows, of course. He takes his own medicine brandy in a silver hip flask, says it warms the bones and sharpens the mind, though by the time the train hits the next station, his voice has softened into that half-slurred calm that comes when the world stops feeling urgent. Outside, the countryside blurs into a dark watercolour as the train barrels through sleeping villages. In the mail car, men sort letters by flickering light, pausing only for a swallow from a bottle. This isn't just about staying awake, it's about staying sharp. Sometimes the stimulant runs too hot fast, breathless chatter and wide, glassy eyes. Sometimes too far the other way, a slow, syrupy nod. But the letters move, the bags empty and refill. By dawn, the car smells of paper, damp wool, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of cocoa wine. Victorian life called itself orderly, moral, and industrious. But behind the railways, factories, and punctual post was another fuel laudanum in teacups. Gin in the afternoon, cocoa wine at night. Medicine wasn't temptation, it was solution. Rich or poor, everyone learned the same truth: a tired body can be tricked, a restless mind softened. They didn't call it addiction, they called it getting through the day, and maybe, under the same soot-thick sky and bone-deep ache, you would have too. The bottles remain now in museums and antique shops, glass ghosts that once held comfort and poison in the same sip. Raise your glass tonight, not in praise, but in acknowledgement the distance between their age and ours is measured not